could not darn the rent in her dress with this continual motion, and she looked up to remonstrate. As she threw her head back for this purpose, she caught the eye of the gentleman who was standing by. It was so expressive of amusement at the airs and graces of his pretty partner, that Ruth was infected by the feeling, and had to bend her face down to conceal the smile that mantled there. But not before he had seen it, and not before his attention had been thereby drawn to consider the kneeling figure, that, habited in black up to the throat, with the noble head bent down to the occupation in which she was engaged, formed such a contrast to the flippant, bright, artificial girl, who sat to be served with an air as haughty as a queen on her throne. "Oh, Mr Bellingham, I'm ashamed to detain you so long. I had no idea any one could have spent so much time over a little tear. No wonder Mrs Mason charges so much for dressmaking, if her workwomen are so slow." It was meant to be witty, but Mr Bellingham looked grave. He saw the scarlet colour of annoyance flush to that beautiful cheek, which was partially presented to him. He took a candle from the table, and held it so that Ruth had more light. She did not look up to thank him, for she felt ashamed that he should have seen the smile which she had caught from him. "I am sorry I have been so long, ma'am," she said gently, as she finished her work. "I was afraid it might tear out again if I did not do it carefully." She rose. "I would rather have it torn than have missed that charming galop," said the young lady, shaking out her dress as a bird shakes its plumage. "Shall we go, Mr Bellingham?" looking up at him. He was surprised that she gave no word or sign of thanks to the assistant. He took up a camellia that some one had left on the table. "Allow me, Miss Duncombe, to give this, in your name, to this young lady, as thanks for her dexterous help." "Oh, of course," said she. Ruth received the flowers silently, but with a grave, modest motion of her head. They had gone, and she was once more alone. Presently her companions returned. "What was the matter with Miss Duncombe? Did she come here?" asked they. "Only her lace dress was torn, and I mended it," answered Ruth quickly. "Did Mr Bellingham come with her? They say he's going to be married to her. Did he come, Ruth?" "Yes," said Ruth, and relapsed into silence. Mr Bellingham danced on gaily and merrily through the night, and fitted with Miss Duncombe as he thought good. But he looked often to the side door, where the milliner's apprentices stood, and once he recognised the tall, slight figure, and the rich auburn hair of the girl in black, and then his eyes sought for the camellia. It was there, snowy white in her bosom, and he danced on more gaily than ever. The cold grey dawn was drearily lighting up the streets when Mrs Mason and her company returned home. The lamps were extinguished, yet the shutters of the shops and dwelling houses were not opened. All sounds had an echo unheard of by day. One or two houseless beggars sat on doorsteps, and shivering, slept with heads bowed on their knees, or resting against the cold, hard support afforded by the wall. Ruth felt as if a dream had melted away, and she were once more in the actual world. How long would it be, even in the most favourable chance, before she should again enter the Shire-hall, or hear a band of music, or even see again those bright happy people, as much without any semblance of care or woe as if they belonged to another race of beings? Had they ever to deny themselves a wish, much less a want? Literally and figuratively, their lives seemed to wander through flowery pleasure paths. Here was cold biting midwinter for her, and such as her, for those poor beggars, almost a season of death. but to Miss Dunscombe and her companions a happy merry time, when flowers still bloomed, and fires crackled, and comforts and luxuries were piled around them like fairy gifts. What did they know of the meaning of the word so terrific to the poor? What was winter to them? But Ruth fancied that Mr Bellingham looked as if he could understand the feelings of those removed from him by circumstance and station. He had drawn up the windows of his carriage, it is true, with a shudder. Ruth, then, had been watching him. Yet she had no idea that any association made her camellia precious to her. She believed it was solely on account of its exquisite beauty that she tended it so carefully. She told Jenny every particular of its presentation, with open, straight-looking eye, and without the deepening of a shade of colour. Was it not kind of him? You can't think how nicely he did it, just when I was a little bit mortified by her ungracious ways. It was very nice indeed, replied Jenny. Such a beautiful flower. I wish it had some scent. I wish it to be exactly as it is. It is perfect, so pure, said Ruth, almost clasping her treasure as she placed it in water. Who is Mr Bellingham? He is son to that Mrs Bellingham of the Priory, for whom we made the grey satin pelisse, answered Jenny sleepily. That was before my time, said Ruth. But there was no answer. Jenny was asleep. It was long before Ruth followed her example. Even on a winter day, it was clear morning light that fell upon her face as she smiled in her slumber. Jenny would not waken her, but watched her face with admiration. It was so lovely in its happiness. She is dreaming of last night, thought Jenny. It was true she was, but one figure flitted more than all the rest through her visions. He presented flower after flower to her in that baseless morning dream, which was all too quickly ended. The night before she had seen her dead mother in her sleep, and she wakened weeping, and now she dreamed of Mr Bellingham and smiled. And yet, was this a more evil dream than the other? The realities of life seemed to cut more sharply against her heart than usual that morning. The late hours of the preceding nights, and perhaps the excitement of the evening before, had indisposed her to bear calmly the rubs and crosses which beset all Mrs Mason's young ladies at times. For Mrs Mason, though the first dressmaker in the county, was human after all, and suffered like her apprentices from the same causes that affected them. This morning she was disposed to find fault with everything and everybody. She seemed to have risen with a determination of putting the world, and all that it contained, her world at least, to rights before night, and abuses and negligence, which had long passed unreproved or winked at, were today to be dragged to light and sharply reprimanded. Nothing less than perfection would satisfy Mrs Mason at such times. She had her ideas of justice too, but they were not divinely beautiful and true ideas. They were something more resembling a grocer's or tea dealer's ideas of equal right. A little overindulgence last night was to be balanced by a good deal of over-severity today, and this manner of rectifying previous errors fully satisfied her conscience. Ruth was not inclined for, or capable of, much extra exertion, and it would have tasked all her powers to have pleased her superior. The workroom seemed filled with sharp calls. "Miss Hilton, where have you put the blue Persian?" Whenever things are mislaid, I know it has been Miss Hilton's evening for siding away. "Miss Hilton was going out last night, so I offered to clear the workroom for her." "I will find it directly, ma'am," answered one of the girls. "Oh, I am well aware of Miss Hilton's custom of shuffling off her duties upon any one who can be induced to relieve her," replied Mrs Mason. Ruth reddened, and tears sprang to her eyes.